We have been conditioned to believe that transparency is synonymous with safety. When you pour a glass of water today, you judge its quality by what you cannot see. No silt, no cloudiness, no movement. It is a modern luxury to assume that a clear liquid is a benign one. We treat the availability of potable water as a baseline of civilization, a boring certainty. But for the vast majority of human history, water was not a background utility. It was a calculated risk. Consider the average resident of a 17th-century European city. They were not ignorant of hygiene, contrary to the popular narrative of the filthy past. They simply viewed the world through a different set of sensory variables. To them, water was a medium of transport, a source of power for mills, and a convenient place to dispose of the byproduct of living. The idea of drinking it was, for many, a desperate last resort. This leads to a question that we rarely stop to ask. How did humanity survive for millennia when its most basic biological requirement was effectively a biological weapon? The answer lies in a series of reasonable yet unintentional workarounds. Because the water in the local well or the communal river was frequently stagnant or downstream from a tannery, the human species spent several centuries in a state of mild, perpetual intoxication. Small beer and watered-down wine were not social choices. They were survival strategies. The fermentation process provided a level of sterilization that the natural world did not. We did not choose alcohol because we wanted to be drunk. We chose it because we wanted to be alive. However, as populations moved from scattered agrarian clusters into the dense, suffocating proximity of the Industrial Revolution, the alcohol solution began to fail against the sheer volume of human waste. We moved into an era where the systems we built to sustain growth became the very mechanisms of our undoing. We thought we were conquering nature by taming the rivers, but we were actually just building a more efficient delivery system for our own demise. The tragedy of this period is not that people were dirty. It is that they were doing exactly what they thought was logical, unaware that the very ground beneath their feet was slowly saturating with something the human body was never meant to process twice. By the mid-19th century, the metropolis had become a biological experiment with no control group. In London, the Thames was both the city's primary artery and its colon. The logic of the time was governed by the miasma theory, the belief that disease was a product of foul odors, a literal corruption of the air. It was a sophisticated error. It allowed authorities to focus on the smell of poverty rather than the mechanics of it. They believed that if you could mask the stench, you could solve the plague. This led to the Great Stink of 1858, a heat wave that turned the river into a fermenting sludge so potent it brought the British Parliament to a standstill. The solution was a triumph of Victorian engineering, a massive network of intercepting sewers designed by Joseph Bazalgette. It was a marvel of brick and gravity, intended to whisk waste away from the nostrils of the elite. Yet this success contained a hidden systemic flaw. The sewers did not treat the water, they merely moved the problem downstream. We often view history as a linear progression toward enlightenment, but in the case of water, it was a series of lateral shifts in risk. By clearing the air, we inadvertently concentrated the poison in the liquid. The arrival of cholera was the first sign that our sensory logic had failed us. Cholera is a remarkably efficient traveler. It requires only a single point of entry into a communal pump to dismantle a neighborhood. Enter Dr. John Snow, a man who viewed the world not through smells, but through maps. When he famously removed the handle from the Broad Street pump, he wasn't just stopping a local epidemic. He was committing an act of heresy against the prevailing scientific order. He proved that the water was the carrier, even when it looked pristine. Yet, the establishment resisted. To accept Snow's findings was to admit that the entire infrastructure of the modern city, the pride of the empire, was fundamentally flawed. It was cheaper to believe in bad air than to dig up the world. We chose to ignore the invisible reality in favor of the visible convenience, creating a feedback loop where the more we grew, the more we poisoned the very foundations of that growth. The unreasonable outcome was now inevitable. A population that had mastered the steam engine but was still being slaughtered by a microscopic hitchhiker in their tea. The final shift did not come from a sudden burst of altruism, but from a cold realization of economic vulnerability. Dead workers do not staff factories, and a city in a constant state of quarantine is a city that cannot trade. The transition to truly clean water required us to stop trusting our eyes and start trusting chemistry. In the late 1800s, the introduction of slow sand filtration and eventually chlorination represented a fundamental change in the human relationship with the environment. We stopped trying to outrun our waste and began to actively deconstruct it. Chlorination, in particular, was an act of controlled chemical warfare. We introduced a poison to the water supply to kill a greater poison. It was an irony that would have baffled a medieval mind. To make the water safe, we had to make it slightly toxic. This brings us to the present, where the unsettling nature of our water is no longer about what is in it, but about the fragility of the systems that keep it out. We live in a brief historical window, roughly 150 years, where the act of drinking is not a gamble. We have outsourced our survival to a labyrinth of subterranean pipes and automated sensors that the average person will never see and cannot explain. The pattern of history suggests that every solution eventually creates its own successor problem. Our ancestors feared the bacteria. We fear the microplastics and the chemical runoff, substances that are, ironically, the byproducts of the very industrial success that gave us clean water in the first place. We have traded acute biological threats for chronic systemic ones. Looking back, the lives of those before clean water were not lived in a state of constant panic, but in a state of constant, low-level adaptation. They were not waiting for us to save them. They were navigating a world with different rules. The unsettling truth is that our current safety is not a permanent achievement of human nature, but a high-maintenance technical fluke. We are still the same biological entities that once drank fermented ale to avoid the pump. The only thing that has changed is the complexity of the filter. If the systems were to pause for even a week, the 17th century would return to our doorsteps with terrifying speed, proving that civilization is, and always has been, just a few microns of filtration away from collapse.